Chicago versus New York, which is the better city? Magnificent 40, 50, 100-story buildings all down and across the river. Chicago versus New York, which is the better city? This is Steve Gibson reporting. A shout out to Tiger Logic, my production company, for their tremendous production quality. I am going to admit to some bias. I was born in Chicago and have a natural affinity for Chicago. And therefore, although this is somewhat of an opinion piece, I'm going to invite commentary, other people to put out podcasts as I do to make the argument for the other side. I'm going to invite someone in favor of New York as the better city over Chicago to join me on a podcast debate on this question. Let's take a look and let's take a deep dive into Chicago versus New York. Let's first take a look at architecture. What is the superior level of architecture between New York and Chicago? While New York has a vast greater number of taller structures, I will make the argument that Chicago architecture is vastly superior. There is no building in New York that matches both the architectural splendor, the positioning, and the entire dynamic of the Wrigley Building. You combine the Wrigley Building with the Tribune Tower and the fact that they are juxtaposed together on the Chicago River, across from each other on Michigan Avenue. There is nothing that even comes close to the majesty of those buildings. There was a building boom in the 1920s in Chicago with respect to the Field Museum, the Civic Opera House, and a wide array of other buildings that put New York architecture to shame. There is nothing that compares in New York City to the Merchandise Mart. These are architectural structures that are absolutely tremendous. I will grant you that the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building are certainly magnificent structures, but I would counter with the fact that the Sears Tower and the John Hancock Tower are in and of themselves splendid as well. You have a mixture of architectural features in Chicago that you simply don't have by comparison in New York. Here's the other thing with respect to how the architecture works. You have not only the lakefront, but you have the river with the central branch, the south and the north branches, all dividing the city in a manner with the raisable bridges, the movable bridges that no other city has, that makes not just a lakefront and a waterfront, but a riverfront and a Riverwalk, all that are set against magnificent 40, 50, 100-story buildings all down and across the river. You do have a waterfront in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, but you don't have the walkable waterways. You don't have the parks. At one level, you have FDR, but there's nothing that really accommodates the kind of interaction with respect to the walking population and the waterfronts. All along Lake Michigan, you have in downtown Chicago a wide array of beaches that you simply do not have along the line of Manhattan. You have that runnable stretch of parks, in beaches that is not to be compared with. There is nothing in New York that even comes close to the long line of parks along Lakeshore Drive and the museums that are associated with those parks in New York City. I'm not saying that there aren't fabulous museums in New York City. What I am arguing is that the placement of the museum campuses in Chicago, along with the parks and the beaches, make it for an absolutely splendid display, independent of the fact that along all of those parks and beaches, you have things like the Buckingham Fountain that you simply do not have in New York City. Now, some may argue that Central Park is ginormous and Central Park provides an array of natural interaction that New Yorkers love and adore. I have no question with that. Central Park is certainly a delightful area. The problem, though, is that Central Park does not abut any vast body of water like Lake Michigan, and does not have beaches like Lake Michigan has against the downtown Lakeshore Drive assemblage. These are simply incomparable aspects of Chicago. All right, let's talk about something that arguably New York is superior at, and that is theater and entertainment. I will grant you that Broadway and other entertainment venues are more substantial and more robust in New York. That having been said, it's not as big of an advantage as one might believe. There is plenty of small indigenous theater that is absolutely charming in Chicago. There's the Shakespeare Theater, independent of the fact that Broadway comes to many of the Chicago theaters. I can account at least 5 theaters in Chicago that house Broadway shows. The fact that they originate in New York is beside the point at some level. Can you see Broadway level productions in Chicago? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Can you see smaller theater productions that are indigenous to Chicago in Chicago? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Apart from New York, Chicago has the most robust theater infrastructure in the country, hands down. So I will give a few extra marks to New York with respect to theater and entertainment structures, but I will make the argument that that is a marginal advantage at best. Let's talk about food. Which city has the better food? I think that there's an argument that Chicago cuisine is superior. You have Greek restaurants here that are not just Greek food, but run by Greek management, that are effectively diners that incorporate some of the Grecian aspects into it. They are absolutely magnificent. Italian food, Chinese food, French food, Michelin star restaurants abound in Chicago. I'm going to give New York a marginal benefit to ultimately the totality of cuisine as opposed to Chicago, but I'm going to tell you that is a marginal level of a benefit towards New York right now. So far, architecture, the city structure, that's in benefit of Chicago. I'm giving small marks of advantage to entertainment, theater, and food to New York, but those are marginal. Let's talk about people. Some of my best friends are New Yorkers, but I'm going to tell you that there is a kindness, generally speaking, a seriousness, a friendliness, a Midwestern friendliness to Chicago that you simply don't find in New York. I love New Yorkers' sense of humor. I love the directness of New Yorkers, but hands down, people like Chicagoans better. And I'm going to give that measure in favor of Chicago. So we're basically 2-2 so far. Let's talk about business community. Now, business community is a little bit challenging because there's a variety of businesses that are involved here. New York is the world's financial center. There should be no question at some level that New York business is more robust than Chicago. But when it comes to food and agriculture business, transportation, law firms, and a variety of other businesses, Chicago outstretches New York. Where do you want to do business? Where do you want to start up a business? What is more business amenable? I'm going to give a small benefit to New York in terms of business, but that is going to be somewhat marginal. Let's talk about education. Well, you're going to talk at some level about different levels of educational systems. In terms of grammar in high school, I think that there's no question that the suburban Chicago metropolitan systems are some of the best in the country, if not the world. I'll put them against anybody. I think the magnet schools in Chicago City proper are some of the top grammar schools and high schools in the country. I'm going to call this one even with respect to grammar schools and high schools. I think that the upper educational echelon, I'm going to make the argument that Chicago is better. New York, Northwestern, University of Chicago, Columbia, NYU, and all of the other schools that are associated with same. I'm going to make the argument in totality that the total educational system in Chicago, the Chicago Metro, which is also Chicagoland, is superior to New York. Now, I think that there's a long way to go in both the city systems in New York and the city systems in Chicago. But if you accumulate the suburban systems with the higher educational systems and the entire dynamic of what's happening with respect to these educational institutions, including some of the wokeness that's happening in all of these institutions, I'm going to make the argument in favor of Chicago systems. Now, here's a decisive advantage in favor of Chicago, and that is cost of living, housing, and what you can get for the money. There is absolutely no question that what you can get in Chicago for your dollar is vastly superior. While even imagining 2,000 to 3,000 square feet in a condo or a brownstone in New York for anything under $5 million would be hogwash. You can get substantial amenities and properties in Chicago for a fraction of what you would pay in New York City. And these are properties with unbelievable views. If you were coming from New York and you came to Chicago, you literally would not believe the views that you could get in Chicago for the money. These are views up and down the river, out into the lake, some of the most magical views from whether you want 50 stories high, 70 stories high, 90 stories high. These are all magical views. Or if you want a plethora of brownstones along tree-lined streets with restaurants and entertainment and grocery stores that are readily available, these are all properties that you can get in Chicago that, for the most part, are unattainable for many in New York City. Even though you might make more money in New York, the marginal dollars that net dollars that you're getting in New York with respect to New York state, city, and local taxes take a much bigger chunk out of what you're paying in Chicago in terms of what you're getting at the end of the day as your net pay for what you're paying in terms of the cost of living. Then we're going to talk about transportation. I think that you have robust transportation systems in both cities, but in terms of livability for the cost of living and the access to public transit, the Metro, and the vast train system that you have in the city of Chicago, that is ultimately going to be an advantage for Chicago over New York. Even though both cities have robust systems, what you're talking about is accessibility from the housing that you can actually purchase in Chicago or reasonably rent in Chicago compared to New York. You have to go way, way, way farther in New York to get the kind of property that you would absolutely be able to attain in Chicago. All in all, you're talking about a vastly superior not only cost of living structure, but livability structure as well with respect to these transportation systems. I think that you also have to take a look at what is going to be, at the beginning and at the end of the day, your overall quality of life. Now, some are going to say that Chicago weather is vastly more harsh than New York. I think that that is overstated. New York has some brutal winters. It has some brutal nor'easters. There's going to be potential impact from hurricanes that are turning down that impact New York. I think that Chicago weather, like New York, has a delightful four seasons. With global warming, I think that we're seeing some milder weather in Chicago as well. So I think from a quality of life perspective, if you put everything together, Chicago is going to come out on top. That doesn't mean New York isn't a fabulous city. And I'm asking all of those New Yorkers out there to combat what I'm talking about. Lastly, they don't have the Chicago Cubs and they don't have the Chicago Bears. If you want to root for the Giants and the Jets, be my guest. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe. I'm not anticipating any New Yorkers liking this, but I do welcome their comments.